Hey everyone. Tonight, we're ending a journey that began with a handshake and ended with silence, shame, and shadows that still stretch across modern Spycraft. It's the story of two men who thought they were saving Europe. Instead, they became pawns in a lie so perfect, it fooled everyone, including them. A trap so smooth it didn't need guns, just charm, paper, and a soft voice saying, "Trust me." This is the part of the story where nobody wins, where alliances fall apart, where brave men are forgotten, and where intelligence becomes something colder and less human. But it's also the part we can't look away from, because it still lives in our modern world, in every whisper of diplomacy, in every double agent smile, in every politician who thinks there's such a thing as a moderate monster. Before we dive in, go ahead and hit like and subscribe if you value hard history, the kind that doesn't flinch. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from and what hour it is. I love seeing who else is staying up late with ghosts like these. Now, turn down the lights, let the past breathe, and follow me back to 1939, to a war that hadn't yet begun, and a lesson the world still hasn't learned. It began with a whisper, not a command, not a gunshot, not even a piece of paper, just a whisper, passing through diplomats' corridors in London, murmured in smoky rooms of clubhouses where gentlemen still thought espionage was a gentleman's game. A whisper that somewhere deep inside Hitler's Germany, not everyone was loyal. That perhaps, under the polished boots and the thundering speeches, there were still men, decent, frightened men, who hated what their country had become and were quietly looking for a way out. That whisper would grow into a fantasy, then a strategy, then a trap so perfectly set that it would shatter the illusion of honorable warfare and redefine British intelligence for decades. But in the spring of 1938, it was just a hope, a fragile, desperate hope. Europe, that year, was suspended in a strange kind of twilight. The shadows of war lengthened by the month, yet the light of diplomacy still flickered. Hitler had already absorbed Austria in March. The Anschluss had come swiftly, bloodlessly, and with the kind of brutal efficiency that made the world hold its breath. But even after that, British leaders clung to the belief that the Reich could be managed, negotiated with, reasoned with. To them, the true danger lay not in Hitler's words, but in the possibility that someone else, someone worse, might replace him if he fell. That, at least, was what Neville Chamberlain believed when he flew to Munich in September. The Munich Agreement would later be remembered as the pinnacle of appeasement, a doomed attempt to trade territory for peace, but at the time it was celebrated. Chamberlain returned with smiles and handshakes, waving his folded scrap of paper with Hitler's signature, promising peace for our time. The phrase would become infamous, but in 1938 it soothed a terrified continent. Most people didn't want to believe war was coming. Most people couldn't afford to. But not everyone trusted the paper. Inside the British intelligence services, the secret intelligence service, known publicly as MI6, the mood was far less optimistic. They had watched the rapid militarization of Germany, the expansion of the Luftwaffe, the totalitarian consolidation of the Nazi regime. They'd tracked the quiet arrests, the disappearances, the book burnings, the purging of generals and judges, and they'd begun to wonder, was Hitler truly the unchallengeable ruler his propaganda claimed, or were there cracks beneath the surface? Some in MI6 clung to a possibility that still seemed worth pursuing, that factions inside the Wehrmacht, or even within the Nazi Party itself, were growing uneasy with Hitler's brinkmanship, that generals, diplomats, or intelligence officers might be willing to make contact, share secrets, or even plot his removal. But the British had no proof. They needed someone inside. They needed someone who knew the language, the politics, the back doors, someone who could navigate a world where a handshake could be a death sentence. In the autumn of that same year, a handful of British operatives began to hear something peculiar from their contacts across Europe. Intermediaries, often Dutch, sometimes Swiss, occasionally German exiles, began to pass along strange messages. There were Germans, they said, who wanted to talk, not just defectors or informants, but high-ranking officers, the kind who wore medals and dined with generals, the kind who claimed they were plotting to overthrow Hitler. At first, MI6 was cautious, too cautious perhaps. They had learned the hard way, in the years after the First World War, that intelligence work was as much theater as it was science. Rumors often ran faster than facts, but still the stories multiplied. The supposed German opposition claimed to be in contact with top officers. Some mentioned Ludendorff, others claimed access to Wilhelm Canaris, the enigmatic head of the Abwehr, the official German military intelligence service. And most tantalizing of all, they promised information, specific information, about troop movements, political rivalries, armament production. In London, the whispers became conversations, and the conversations became planning sessions. It was not just about stopping war anymore, it was about controlling how it began, or if it began at all. And if the British could cultivate a secret channel to anti-Nazi elements inside the Third Reich, perhaps they could prevent the worst. But no one asked who was on the other end of the line. What MI6 didn't know, couldn't have known, was that they were not the only ones interested in shadowy deals and invisible lines of communication. In Berlin, another intelligence operation had been unfolding. A darker one that wore the black uniforms of the Schutzstaffel, the SS. While the Abwehr was still run by the cautious, conservative Canaris, the SS's internal security arm, the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, had been rapidly evolving into a ruthlessly effective counterintelligence empire under the iron control of Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. And beneath them, a young, brilliant, and ambitious operative was watching the British very closely. His name was Walter Schellenberg. Schellenberg was not yet 30 when he caught the attention of Heydrich. A former law student with icy charm and a taste for power, he had no military background, no noble lineage, and no illusions about morality. What he had was vision. He understood, better than most in Berlin, that information was not just a tool of statecraft. It was the battlefield itself. Propaganda, sabotage, false leads, forged letters. These weren't tactics. They were strategy. And as whispers of British contact with the so-called German resistance began reaching Berlin through neutral channels, Schellenberg saw an opportunity. He proposed something bold, something theatrical. If the British were so desperate to believe in honorable conspirators, why not give them exactly that, and then destroy them with it? His superiors listened, and then they approved. As 1938 came to a close, British agents were encouraged. Communications were improving, meetings were discussed. The possibility of coordinating with anti-Nazi forces seemed closer than ever. But what they didn't see, what no one saw, was that the lines were being manipulated, that the men they thought were German patriots were in fact SS officers, meticulously playing roles, quoting real generals, and feeding just enough truth to sound credible. They promised access. They hinted at a coup. They asked to meet in person, in a neutral country, somewhere quiet, discreet, somewhere like the Dutch town of Venlo. Back in London, MI6 was preparing cautiously but optimistically. Two experienced field officers, Sigismund Payne Best and Major Richard Stevens, were briefed. Both had intelligence backgrounds, both spoke fluent German, and both believed that they could tell truth from illusion. They were instructed to pursue contacts carefully, to verify information before acting, and to avoid any appearance of espionage in neutral territory. But even with these precautions, the mood was strangely buoyant. It seemed, for the first time, that Hitler might not be invincible, that maybe there were still Germans who believed in something better. What MI6 didn't know was that Best and Stevens had already been named, not in MI6 reports, but in SD files. Their identities, routines, even their travel habits were being charted in Berlin. Schellenberg wasn't just inventing a trap, he was preparing to spring it with surgical precision. And yet, for the British, the fantasy held. Chamberlain continued to defend the Munich Agreement as a victory. The press spoke of peace as if it were permanent. The intelligence world, behind its veil of secrecy, began to entertain the possibility that if they could assist the good Germans in removing Hitler, war could be avoided altogether. What they didn't realize was that the Reich had no intention of stopping at Czechoslovakia, that the machine was already in motion, that the real German resistance, the few men who truly despised Hitler and had the courage to act, were isolated, surveilled, and often dead within weeks of speaking their minds. And most dangerously of all, they failed to grasp the nature of the SS. The SD was not merely an internal police force. It was an ideological weapon, a hybrid of state and party, ruthlessly loyal to Hitler and designed not just to protect the regime, but to destroy its enemies preemptively, real or imagined. Its agents studied not just documents, but psychology. They learned to speak like generals, think like diplomats, lie like actors. And at its core, the SD understood one brutal truth: hope can be weaponized. So, while MI6 dreamed of forging an alliance with the virtuous few inside Nazi Germany, the SD was building an illusion so perfect it would leave the British disoriented, ashamed, and compromised for years. And as the new year approached, those two paths, one paved in idealism, the other in cruelty, raced toward a single intersection. It would not be a battlefield, it would be a quiet meeting on a cold Dutch street. A few words exchanged between strangers, a window rolled down, and then the end of the dream. And just as London placed its hopes in the hands of friendly Germans, a man named Schellenberg began writing their obituary in invisible ink. It began, fittingly enough, with a name that didn't exist. Early in 1939, a message passed discreetly through diplomatic back channels, carried not by a soldier or a spy, but by a businessman, or someone pretending to be one. The sender called himself Dr. Franz Meyer. He claimed to represent a group of high-ranking officers within the German Wehrmacht who were growing increasingly alarmed by Hitler's reckless ambitions. According to Meyer, there were elements within the military command who were not just opposed to the Führer's policies, but were prepared to act against him, if only the British government would offer discreet guarantees of non-interference. They didn't want military assistance. They didn't want money. All they wanted, said Meyer, was a promise that Britain would not crush a new German government if one day Hitler simply vanished. To the outside world, this might have sounded like one of 1,000 wartime rumors. But within the quiet offices of British intelligence, the name sent a tremor through the floor. It wasn't just the content of the message, it was how it was delivered, so carefully, so convincingly, with just enough authentic details to set minds racing. The suggestion of a coup against Hitler was not new, but this time it was coming from someone who appeared to know what he was doing, someone who spoke like a man with real access. In London, the message was received by MI6 operatives familiar with continental back channels, and it reached a man who had long believed that such a moment might come. Sigismund Payne Best, a senior British intelligence officer operating out of The Hague, had been working under official cover as a businessman. Though his reputation was known in intelligence circles, he carried himself with the kind of professional discretion that made even diplomats forget which side of the wall he was on. Best had been watching Germany closely for years, and like many of his colleagues, he wanted to believe that the Nazi regime had enemies within. This message, strange as it was, sounded like the thing they'd all been waiting for. Another MI6 officer, Major Richard Henry Stevens, would soon be drawn into the operation. Stevens, fluent in German and considered one of the younger generation's most promising intelligence officers, brought a technical precision to the work. Together, Best and Stevens represented a kind of duality in British spycraft. Best, the seasoned gentleman; Stevens, the methodical linguist. When their paths converged, the machinery of MI6 believed it had found the right hands to handle what might become the most sensitive negotiation in Europe. Dr. Meyer continued to send messages. He spoke of a group of German patriots who believed Hitler was leading the country toward ruin, and who feared another war would destroy Germany forever. He hinted at secret meetings, at quiet opposition within the general staff, had access to political, military, and even industrial intelligence. At times, he spoke as though he were risking his life to make contact. And perhaps most compelling of all, he claimed that time was running out. The problem, the deadly unspoken problem, was that Franz Meyer did not exist. The man using that name was Walter Schellenberg, operating under deep SS cover. Schellenberg had constructed the identity with meticulous care. He had rehearsed the background story, designed fake credentials, and even created supporting characters who could be invoked to build trust. His letters and messages were designed to sound urgent, but not desperate, informed, but not arrogant. He said just enough to entice and held back just enough to remain mysterious. It was espionage theater performed on the grandest of stages, and Schellenberg was not merely an actor, he was the playwright. The venue for this delicate performance would be the Netherlands, a neutral country carefully positioned between the fractured European powers. Dutch neutrality offered plausible deniability, and its proximity to Germany made it a logical meeting ground. Best and Stevens, working out of The Hague, were instructed to pursue the contact carefully. London approved tentative moves. The signals were clear. Proceed, but with caution. Keep the meetings unofficial. Verify everything. Trust nothing. Yet almost immediately, that last rule began to fray. The initial meetings were arranged with extraordinary care. A third party, another supposed intermediary named Fischer, would act as go-between. He claimed to be associated with conservative industrialists and officers who had access to the inner chambers of the Reich. He dressed modestly, spoke in clipped tones, and never volunteered too much. At one meeting, he produced a document purporting to be from a senior German official outlining a framework for a post-Hitler provisional government. At another, he referenced internal Reich military planning in a way that suggested deep access. Some of it was true, much of it was not. Each interaction played on the same emotional fulcrum, the idea that there were still good men inside Germany, quietly planning to stop a madman before it was too late. This idea, once planted, grew rapidly inside British intelligence circles. It became a kind of psychological anchor. After years of watching Hitler rise unchecked, the notion that the solution might come from within, that Germany might save itself, was profoundly attractive. It seemed to validate the belief that appeasement had not been weakness, but strategy. What neither Best nor Stevens fully grasped, though they may have suspected it at moments, was that they were no longer managing the conversation. They were following it. Each piece of information provided by the Phantom Resistance served a dual purpose. It enticed British confidence while giving the SS insight into MI6's decision-making process. When Best shared subtle questions from London, Schellenberg was listening. When Stevens expressed frustrations or cautions, the SD took note. The trap was being built not just with forged letters and false names, but with the words of the British themselves. Schellenberg's genius lay in creating ambiguity that couldn't be easily disproven. He didn't say too much. He didn't claim miracles. He let his targets fill in the blanks with their own hopes. He understood that in the world of spies, certainty is rare, and so belief becomes a form of currency. Best and Stevens, both intelligent and experienced, were not naive, but they were working inside a system that wanted to believe. And in intelligence, institutional hope can be more dangerous than ignorance. More meetings followed. Each time, the Germans played the same subtle game. They hinted at imminent plots. They invoked names from within the Reich military hierarchy. They asked probing questions about British responses. They requested informal commitments, nothing legally binding, just assurances, verbal ones, just enough to suggest trust. At one point, Schellenberg, still playing Meyer, began referring to a senior general who had allegedly spoken directly of removing Hitler by force. The suggestion was that a coup was not just possible, but imminent, but only if Britain would support the new regime diplomatically. Best relayed this to London. The response from headquarters was careful, measured, but open. The idea of toppling Hitler from within, without war, was worth almost any risk, And still, no one asked, how had this resistance group so easily found the British? Why were they so eager to meet, to share? Why were they never caught by the Gestapo? The answer was simple. They were the Gestapo. Back in Berlin, Reinhard Heydrich monitored the operation's progress with growing satisfaction. The information extracted was becoming increasingly valuable. British agents were describing MI6's organizational structure, its decision-making chain, its blind spots. And though Best and Stevens believed they were protecting their sources and methods, they were already bleeding secrets, slowly, quietly, fatally. The long con was working, and as the spring of 1939 gave way to summer, the stakes increased. Hitler had taken the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March, shredding the Munich Agreement and proving finally that his ambitions would not be satisfied with just the Sudetenland. Even Chamberlain began to doubt. In the intelligence world, this shift was seismic. The hope of appeasement faded, the fear of war returned, and suddenly the conversations with Dr. Meyer no longer felt like abstract diplomacy. They began to feel like the last hope of avoiding catastrophe. Schellenberg, sensing the shift, adjusted accordingly. The resistance now claimed to be under pressure. Their window to act was closing. If the British wanted to be part of the solution, they had to act quickly. And most importantly, they had to meet in person. A face-to-face meeting would be essential. Details would need to be discussed. The future of Germany could not be decided by letters. Best and Stevens hesitated. The idea of a physical meeting with German officers, even in neutral territory, carried immense risk. It violated every protocol, and yet it also seemed necessary. The longer the negotiations dragged on, the less trust could be maintained from afar. And the men claiming to represent the resistance, the SS actors in plain clothes, made sure to say the right things. They were risking their lives, they said. They could be caught at any moment. They could be executed. Surely the British could match that bravery. The pressure mounted. The meetings grew longer. The messages became more urgent. And in late summer of 1939, just as Europe braced for the inevitable showdown over Poland, Schellenberg made the boldest move yet. He introduced a new character into the story, a supposed senior officer from the Abwehr itself, one who allegedly sympathized with the resistance. This officer claimed to have access to internal communications that could prove Germany's war plans. He offered to meet the British directly. The fiction was growing bolder, and yet the British still leaned in. The message was clear. Kill Hitler, and Germany would collapse in a day. But what Best didn't know was that the man saying it wore an SS uniform beneath his coat. They thought they were getting closer to overthrowing Hitler. In truth, every meeting brought British intelligence 1 foot closer to the abyss. Yet no one, not in The Hague, not in Berlin, and certainly not in the subdued offices of Section D in London, could see the edge of that cliff, because the men walking toward it weren't running. They were strolling, briefcases in hand, nodding to what they thought were allies across a table they believed to be neutral ground. And perhaps that was the most diabolical part of all. There were no weapons drawn, no blood spilled, no slamming doors or flashing warnings. Just tea and politeness and lies laced with German punctuality. Venlo had been chosen for its blandness. It was quiet, close to the Dutch-German border, yet comfortably in the Netherlands. Its hotel lobbies and street cafes allowed for just enough ambiguity, neither too cosmopolitan to attract attention, nor so provincial that the presence of foreigners would raise eyebrows. But most of all, it offered one critical advantage. It was close enough to the Reich for Schellenberg to play puppet master in real time, but just far enough for the British to convince themselves they were safe. The Dutch police didn't know they were being used. The British didn't know they were being watched. Only the Germans knew the full script, and they were rewriting it with every handshake. When Stevens and Best arrived in Venlo for their first direct meeting on October 5th, 1939, they were already deep in the psychological maze crafted by their German counterparts. By then, the British had come to believe they were on the verge of something extraordinary, a conspiracy of Wehrmacht generals, Abwehr operatives, and conservative politicians who detested Hitler and were waiting, just waiting, for a signal from London. All they needed was reassurance that Britain would not crush them along with the Nazi regime should they act. It was a seduction built not on romance, but ideology. The lie was not just plausible, it was desirable. Schellenberg knew it. Every word, every pause, every missive from Berlin was calculated to deepen the illusion. In these early October meetings, he ensured that his agents, posing as resistance insiders, delivered just enough detail to keep Stevens interested, but not suspicious. They spoke of potential coup timings, of key military figures supposedly prepared to act, of phantom meetings inside Germany where generals passed around blueprints of Hitler's fall like contraband literature. The effect was narcotic. MI6 wanted to believe. And belief, more than truth, is what leads even professionals off a cliff. But the trap wasn't just psychological. Schellenberg had a more immediate goal: extraction of information. Real operational British intelligence data, names, codenames, patterns, and procedural vulnerabilities. And that required patience. Not the kind that waits quietly, but the kind that performs. He instructed his agents to remain inconsistent just enough to seem human. The story changed slightly here and there, not enough to provoke alarm, but enough to spark concern. Concern that made British agents talk more, explain more, clarify more. And clarify they did. Best, in particular, had grown emotionally invested. His military background and firm belief in the old guard of Prussian honor made him a perfect target. He wanted to believe that not all of Germany had been consumed by Hitler's fanaticism. The idea of dealing with rational, educated men like the ones he'd served with or studied alongside before the war, comforted him. That, in turn, made him vulnerable. At each meeting, the Germans began to press just a little harder. They asked for confirmation. Was Colonel X still operating under that code name? Was Agent Y the same person as the man once listed in a previous dossier from Belgium? Could Stevens kindly clarify the structure of SIS field units in The Hague? Could Best provide insight into how British case officers were dispatched under diplomatic cover? Each request came wrapped in the promise that it would help the resistance coordinate more effectively with London. And the answers, casually offered, earnestly given, were noted in invisible ink by men who would soon hand them to Heydrich. Meanwhile, in London, the pressure was mounting. The new war with Germany had exploded into chaos far faster than Chamberlain had anticipated, and with it came the terrifying realization that British intelligence was playing catch-up. The MI6 leadership wanted results. They wanted contacts, assurances, plans. They wanted, above all else, something tangible. And so they pushed. Section D, the semi-autonomous department tasked with sabotage and covert diplomacy, was under strain to deliver proof that internal resistance within Germany was real and capable. Venlo became their candle in the dark. No one wanted to extinguish it, not even to inspect the flame. That suited Schellenberg perfectly. Each meeting, each message relayed, each small bit of false encouragement drove the British deeper into dependency. He began orchestrating overlapping promises. One day, the resistance claimed to be on the verge of staging a major assassination attempt. The next, they whispered about secret factions inside the Reichswehr willing to turn their guns on Berlin. And with each promise, more names were dropped. Some were real, intelligence gleaned from decoded transmissions or foreign archives. Others were inventions, designed to test British knowledge or bait further disclosures. One such moment came during a particularly delicate session on October 17th. The German envoy, posing as a lieutenant colonel in the resistance, mentioned an upcoming meeting between several high-ranking generals and hinted that a known British contact might be in danger if he remained in Germany. Alarmed, Best responded with concern and immediately named 2 other contacts, hoping to help the Germans warn them in time. The Germans, of course, already knew about these men, but now they had confirmation. And more importantly, they knew how Best reacted under pressure. By late October, the game had escalated. The meetings were now weekly. Each time, a car would be sent to ferry Stevens and Best from their Dutch safe houses to the agreed location in Venlo. The drivers were always German. The hotels and cafes were pre-selected, the timing precise. The Germans controlled every element, and the British didn't know it. At one point, Schellenberg even considered planting listening devices in their cars, but Heydrich vetoed the plan. He wanted the trap clean, elegant, no premature alarms, and certainly no evidence. London, oblivious to the looming danger, doubled down. Encouraged by the supposed growing boldness of the German resistance, MI6 authorized more communication. Messages were exchanged through couriers. Secure cables were routed through embassies. At least one cipher clerk in The Hague began noticing increased volumes of diplomatic traffic. But no one raised the alarm. After all, these were just friendly conversations between allies, weren't they? Schellenberg's genius lay not only in the deception, but in how he maintained its credibility. He introduced delays, claimed that certain resistance figures had been arrested, or that key messages needed time to be verified. These pauses gave the illusion of risk. They made the British nervous, but not too nervous. And in that nervousness, more secrets spilled. At one meeting in early November, a German agent, claiming to be close to a high-ranking general, produced what appeared to be a fragment of a classified German military plan. It was a fake, crafted in Berlin and aged to look like an internal document. But it did the trick. Best and Stevens, astonished, immediately asked for more. They promised that if the resistance could keep delivering material like this, the British government might consider supplying limited financial or logistical support. Support. That word electrified Heydrich. It meant the British were prepared to go beyond conversation, and if they were willing to invest, they'd become more predictable, more exposed, more desperate. So Schellenberg pressed further. He fed them details of an upcoming resistance meeting, supposedly in Cologne. He asked if the British could send someone inside Germany to attend. Not yet, the British replied. Too risky. But soon, maybe even in December. Schellenberg nodded politely and took notes. Meanwhile, the SS began assembling a larger dossier. The notes from each Venlo meeting were compiled, cross-referenced, and studied. By now, they had a partial map of SIS operations in the Low Countries. They had names, safe houses, diplomatic routes, even partial decrypts of British cipher patterns. The British had handed over, unwittingly, the architecture of their presence in Western Europe, and they had done so with handshakes and smiles. But Schellenberg wasn't done. He wanted one final confirmation, a signal that the British were fully invested. And for that, he dangled a bait too delicious to ignore, a promise that Hitler himself could be assassinated within weeks, if London gave the green light. The plan, he said, had been prepared. All that remained was political cover. The generals were waiting. Best, wide-eyed, returned to The Hague and immediately dispatched a memo to London. The reaction was one of cautious awe. Could it be real? Could Hitler be dead before Christmas? And if so, what would replace him? A military junta? A return to the Kaiser? Or worse, another madman in uniform? The questions piled up, and in the silence between answers, a decision was made. Stevens and Best would return to Venlo. One more meeting, one more chance to secure the future of Europe. And so, on November 8, 1939, as the rain darkened the cobblestones of the sleepy border town, the two British agents climbed into a car, bound once more for a rendezvous they believed would end in liberation. What they didn't know was that Reinhard Heydrich had already signed the order. And just 24 hours earlier, an explosion had torn through a Munich beer hall, missing Hitler by minutes and giving Himmler the perfect excuse to strike back at his enemies, real and imagined. In Berlin, the Gestapo was already packing the van, and in Venlo, the abyss had already opened. It was not the cold wind rolling off the Dutch border that unnerved them as the car hummed toward Venlo on that early November night. It was the silence. Sigismund Payne-Best, sitting in the back seat, stared at the faint reflection of his own face in the window and tried to tell himself that everything was fine. He had told himself the same thing dozens of times before each meeting, but this time, the silence felt heavier. Perhaps it was the echo of London's latest instructions, urgent yet strangely contradictory. Perhaps it was the ripple effects of news from Munich, an assassination attempt on Hitler, a bomb that had exploded in a beer hall and missed him by minutes. Or perhaps it was the nagging voice deep inside Best's mind, whispering the one thought he could not share with anyone, not even Richard Stevens seated beside him. What if we have been wrong about all of it? That question had begun to surface in private corridors in London too, though no one wanted to admit it. The British government was now fighting a war it had tried desperately to avoid, and in such circumstances, illusions were easy to cling to. Neville Chamberlain, still Prime Minister, still reluctant to abandon the cautious diplomacy he had built his career on, viewed the contacts at Venlo as a potential lifeline. If there truly was a faction within Germany capable of deposing Hitler, perhaps the war could end before it consumed all of Europe. Perhaps peace could still be salvaged. To Chamberlain, that possibility outweighed the risk, but not everyone agreed. Winston Churchill, elevated to First Lord of the Admiralty when war erupted in September, was far less convinced. To him, the idea that elements of the Wehrmacht or conservative elites would remove Hitler without being driven to the wall was dangerously naive. He had said so in cabinet, warning that the so-called resistance contacts might be nothing more than German disinformation. Churchill's warnings were met with polite nods and bureaucratic murmurs. The Prime Minister's inner circle still believed they could outmaneuver Hitler through careful engagement. Churchill, increasingly isolated, could only watch as the meetings in Venlo continued unchecked. This divide, appeasement versus preemption, caution versus confrontation, was not new. It had defined British foreign policy for years, but by November 1939, it had hardened into an almost doctrinal split. Chamberlain and his supporters insisted that Britain must hold the moral high ground, that they could not be seen violating neutral territory or engaging in operations that looked like targeted assassinations. Churchill and his allies believed that such timidity would be fatal. Each side saw the other as reckless. Each believed history would vindicate them. And in the shadow of that argument, Best and Stevens kept driving toward Venlo. The Dutch authorities, for their part, played a quiet and careful game. The Netherlands was neutral, and neutrality was survival. They were not blind to the British presence in their territory, nor to the suspicious comings and goings of Germans near the border. But they tolerated it, hoping that by turning a blind eye, they could avoid provoking Berlin. Dutch police officers were occasionally instructed to monitor the meetings discreetly, but they were not to interfere. This decision, pragmatic at the time, would later be judged harshly. But in November 1939, it was simply one more example of how small nations caught between great powers were forced to gamble. The British, meanwhile, told themselves that their contacts with the German resistance were protected by the same principle. Venlo was neutral. Surely the SS or Gestapo would not dare act so brazenly on foreign soil. Even Churchill, as skeptical as he was, could not imagine that Hitler's agents would risk an international incident by kidnapping British officers in the Netherlands. The idea seemed unthinkable, and yet the unthinkable was precisely what Reinhard Heydrich was planning. There were warning signs, of course, subtle anomalies in the German narrative, small inconsistencies in the stories told by the supposed resistance officers. A name that shifted slightly from one meeting to the next, a claim about troop deployments that did not quite match other intelligence. Best noticed some of these details and mentioned them in his reports. Stevens, too, raised questions about why the Germans had become so insistent on face-to-face meetings. But their superiors in London dismissed these concerns. To Section D, the risks were acceptable. After all, the contacts had already yielded valuable information. Intelligence about German command structure, about morale in the officer corps, about the possibility of assassination plots. Some of it was true, some of it wasn't. But London did not have the luxury of absolute certainty, and so they pressed on. Inside MI6 headquarters, the atmosphere was tense, but hopeful. The operation at Venlo was not officially sanctioned at the highest level of government, but it was tolerated, even quietly encouraged, because it fit the broader narrative Chamberlain wanted to believe. Britain was not without options. Germany was not united behind Hitler. There were still levers to be pulled, alliances to be made, off-ramps to be found. In such an environment, doubt was a luxury. Bureaucratic optimism became policy. The Dutch government, receiving vague assurances from British diplomats that nothing untoward was happening, maintained its studied silence. Dutch border police occasionally saw unfamiliar vehicles idling near the rendezvous sites, but chalked it up to normal intelligence maneuvering. What could they do, after all? To intervene might invite German retaliation. To allow it to continue might keep Britain friendly. In that fine balance lay the illusion of control. On November 8th, the day before the next scheduled meeting, news broke of the Munich beer hall bombing. The blast, meant to kill Hitler, instead killed 8 others and wounded dozens. The Führer, having left the hall minutes earlier, emerged unscathed. In Berlin, the regime erupted in rage. The Gestapo launched a massive crackdown, arresting hundreds, interrogating thousands. The official narrative was that a lone radical had acted, but privately Himmler and Heydrich used the moment to justify every purge they had ever dreamed of. The timing was perfect for Venlo. In London, the bombing added urgency to the Venlo meetings. If the German resistance was truly capable of striking at Hitler, then perhaps they had been involved in the attempt. Perhaps the contacts cultivated by Best and Stevens were closer to success than anyone realized. Section D demanded updates. Chamberlain's ministers asked whether this could be the opening Britain had been waiting for. Churchill scoffed, pointing out that the British knew almost nothing about the men they were dealing with. His words carried little weight. No one wanted to hear that the one bright thread of hope might be a noose. Back in the Netherlands, Best and Stevens prepared for their November 9th rendezvous. The instructions were the same as always: travel light, no visible weapons, minimal escort. They would meet their German counterparts in Venlo, hear whatever new intelligence they had to offer, and report back. Neither man questioned the wisdom of the procedure. They had done it so many times before, and the Germans, after all, had always been punctual, polite, even deferential. Why would they risk shattering that trust now? Because, thought Heydrich as he reviewed the final plan, trust was the trap. He had everything he needed: the names, the organizational charts, the proof of British willingness to conspire against Hitler. Now he wanted the agents themselves. Their capture would humiliate MI6, disrupt its operations in Western Europe, and provide Berlin with priceless propaganda. And most importantly, it would prove that the SS could reach across borders with impunity. The British, blind to the abyss, saw only opportunity. They believed they were edging closer to a coup that could change the course of the war. The Dutch, fearful and neutral, convinced themselves that nothing would happen on their soil. And Chamberlain, burdened by the weight of war and desperate for a way out, allowed hope to obscure the danger. Their next meeting was scheduled for November 9th, in Venlo. No weapons, no escorts, because what could possibly go wrong in neutral territory? It began with a silence so total it felt unnatural. Not the silence of secrecy, nor the careful hush of diplomacy, but the kind that belongs to a battlefield, a breath before the first gunshot. At 8:15 a.m. on November 9th, 1939, Payne Best straightened his coat collar against the cold air curling in from the Maas River. He didn't know, as he adjusted his gloves, that it would be the last time he ever touched freedom on his own terms. The frost that clung to the windshield of the waiting car seemed to thicken with each passing moment, a silent omen of the storm about to break. Across from him, Richard Stevens sat silently, folding a telegram into his coat pocket with more force than necessary. He hadn't slept much, neither had Best. The tension from London, pressure to extract a final, actionable plan from these so-called German resistance emissaries, had grown unbearable. What they didn't know was that everything had already been decided. by someone else, somewhere else. The SS had been planning this moment for months. Every detail of the elaborate lie that lured MI6 into Dutch territory had been meticulously scripted. But it wasn't until this very day, November 9th, the anniversary of Hitler's failed beer hall putsch, that the timing fell into place with dreadful perfection. That morning, Reinhard Heydrich himself sat behind his desk in Berlin, glancing once more at the operation's coded green light. He had no doubts. Neither did Walter Schellenberg, who had played the role of loyal resistance insider to British intelligence with flawless precision. He'd smiled during their meetings, promised revolts, hinted at the Wehrmacht turning on Hitler. But he had never once slipped out of character, never once let on that every word had been a performance aimed not at negotiation, but abduction. As the two British agents drove toward the outskirts of Venlo, their driver, a Dutch intermediary named Dirk Klopp, who had no idea he was about to become collateral damage, navigated cautiously toward the Café Rendezvous. The roads were quiet, still. The entire village of Venlo remained wrapped in that same eerie calm, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Just over the German border, less than a mile away, SS storm units waited in blacked-out trucks. Engines idled. Weapons were checked. Orders were given one last time. Wait for the signal. Move fast. Shoot, if necessary. The SS didn't fear diplomatic repercussions. They didn't believe in neutral territory. And most dangerously of all, they didn't care. The car rolled to a stop. Best glanced at his watch. Stevens looked out the window. No one in sight. A slight unease crept into the car, like a cold draft, but they said nothing. They were used to nerves before a meeting, but even so, both men had begun to suspect something was off. Too many reschedules, too many changing locations. The previous rendezvous had been rushed, awkward. There were moments when Schellenberg's answers had been just a second too polished, too rehearsed. But then again, who among them wasn't putting on a performance? In a world built on lies, paranoia had become part of the job. The ambush came not with a bang, but a shattering of glass, a scream, a flurry of movement too fast to follow. SS officers in civilian clothes surged forward from both sides, weapons drawn, faces stone-like with purpose. The car door was yanked open. Dirk Klopp shouted in protest, reaching for his weapon, but he never got the chance. One of the Germans shot him point blank in the chest. His body slammed back against the seat, blood blooming through his uniform. Stevens shouted, but was pulled out violently by two men and slammed onto the pavement. Best tried to reach for his ID, screaming something about neutrality, but a fist drove into his stomach with the force of finality. Then he, too, was hauled from the car. In less than 60 seconds, the entire operation was over. No locals interfered, no Dutch patrols arrived, and in the quiet aftermath, the lifeless body of Dirk Klopp lay slumped in the front seat as if asleep, one last loose end in a story that had never been real. The Germans dragged Best and Stevens to a waiting vehicle, bound their hands, and tossed them inside like luggage. They didn't explain. They didn't need to. The truth was already obsolete. As they crossed the border into Germany, no sirens followed. No one stopped them. The lines between diplomacy and aggression had already blurred beyond recognition. And within the hour, a different battle began. The war of headlines. German radio stations interrupted their regular programming with a breathless bulletin. A British terrorist plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler had just been uncovered. 2 foreign spies had been caught red-handed. The British Secret Service, it was claimed, had organized the November 8th Munich bombing of the Burgerbräu Keller. The Venlo abduction was painted not as a violation of neutrality, but a counter-strike. Back in Berlin, Hitler erupted with theatrical fury. The assassination attempt on his life had narrowly failed. The bomb planted by Georg Elser had gone off minutes after he had left the beer hall, but it was the British, he declared, who had orchestrated it, and the arrest of Stevens and Best was all the proof needed. Behind closed doors, Goebbels drafted the propaganda. The SS sent out photographs. MI6, caught flat-footed, scrambled to make sense of the disappearance. Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, received only fragments of information, and each piece pointed toward something darker, something irreversible. Stevens and Best, meanwhile, found themselves shackled in a windowless room, blindfolded and disoriented. The beatings had not yet begun. Those would come later. For now, the SS interrogators were content to let fear do the talking. The radio in the corner, left on deliberately, crackled with a voice they both knew too well. Adolf Hitler's. He was addressing the nation, his tone a mix of triumph and rage. The British, he told millions, had tried to kill him, but they had failed, and Germany would not forget. It was a masterstroke of disinformation. The timing of the Munich bombing, the Venlo kidnapping, and Hitler's survival created a narrative too convenient to challenge. Across Europe, embassies panicked. The Dutch government lodged a quiet protest, but little more. They were terrified of provoking Hitler. The British Foreign Office released a limp statement denying the claims, but the damage was done. Internally, MI6 was thrown into chaos. Their agents had been snatched from under their noses. Their enemy had turned the tables in a single move. But worse still was the realization that they had been played for months. Inside the Reich Security Main Office, Schellenberg calmly debriefed his superiors. The plan had worked better than expected. Not only had they captured 2 high-ranking British officers, but they now possessed reams of intelligence, code names, safe house addresses, MI6 procedures gleaned from the meetings. Even the tiniest detail, spoken casually over coffee, was now a weapon. Every lie Schellenberg had told had a purpose. Every handshake had been a trap. As dawn broke the next day, Hitler issued a new decree. From this point on, Germany would treat all foreign spies as terrorists. The legal gray zone was gone. There would be no more trials, no more negotiations, just imprisonment or death. And as the world watched, confused and divided, one thing became horrifyingly clear. The rules had changed overnight. The Venlo incident wasn't just an abduction, it was a signal. That diplomacy was dead. That war, though not yet declared, had already begun in the shadows. And that the very institutions meant to prevent catastrophe, intelligence, diplomacy, neutrality, could be manipulated with a smile and a forged document. In London, as the scope of the disaster sank in, Churchill paced his office, chain-smoking in grim silence. Best and Stevens were gone, possibly compromised, possibly worse. But even he couldn't know just how far the betrayal reached, or how the ripples from Venlo would shape the war to come. Because while MI6 counted its losses, Germany was already turning its gaze elsewhere. And Stevens and Best, broken and battered, hadn't yet said everything they knew. As the car that had taken them from Venlo disappeared into the heart of the Third Reich, one thing was certain: the world would never be the same. And the cost of trusting a phantom resistance had just been paid, in blood, in silence, and in secrets now buried deep behind enemy lines. They were meant to be ghosts, discreet diplomats threading the impossible line between war and peace, agents not quite spies, not quite emissaries. But the moment Richard Stevens and Sigismund Payne Best were dragged across the border that night, they ceased to be anything but trophies. Their tailored suits, their polished civility, the quiet language of diplomacy, all of it had been stripped in a matter of seconds, traded for the cold, unblinking machinery of Nazi vengeance. And as the wheels of the Black Mercedes roared deeper into Germany, with the SS guards exchanging tight, triumphant glances in the rear view, neither man realized just how far into the abyss they had already fallen. The car didn't stop for hours. When it did, it wasn't in a town or a recognizable border station. It was in a forest clearing lit only by vehicle headlights and the glowing end of a cigarette hanging from the lips of Walter Schellenberg. He stood there like a conductor waiting for his orchestra to arrive, calm, elegant, his hands buried in his coat pockets. The SS officers saluted wordlessly. No one needed to say what had just been accomplished. Operation Trugschluss, The greatest deception in the short, dark history of Nazi counterintelligence had just succeeded beyond any of their wildest calculations. For Best and Stevens, it was still a blur. They were pulled from the car like criminals, not captured envoys, shoved through a steel door into what looked like a makeshift holding cell. There were no formal charges, no consular calls, no Geneva protections. Just silence, punctuated by footsteps on concrete and the hiss of German voices behind glass. At first, both men believed they'd be released in days. After all, the Netherlands was neutral. This was an international incident. The Reich couldn't possibly afford the blowback of such a brazen abduction. Could it? But hours turned into days, days into weeks. They were moved again, this time to Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp reserved for enemies of the Reich with special value. That label gave them certain privileges at first: separate quarters, regular food, less brutal treatment than political prisoners or Jews, but these privileges were barbed in nature, designed to wear down, not protect. Every luxury came with a demand. Every courtesy was a test. The interrogations began softly: a cup of coffee, a warm room, a civilized tone. Names were brought up gently, familiar names, colleagues, friends. Then came the maps, hand-drawn sketches of embassies, cables intercepted in obscure stations across Europe, reports with blank spaces waiting to be filled in. The Germans didn't scream. They didn't beat. They bled information like a surgeon, not a butcher. And the question that haunted both men wasn't just how much they would eventually be made to give up. It was how much the Germans already knew. Best, ever the gentleman, tried to be stoic. He answered nothing directly, veered into ambiguities, insisted he had never been a spy. Stevens, more tightly wound and less experienced in deception, began to unravel faster. They were kept apart for days at a time, never allowed to coordinate. Each fed slightly conflicting stories about the other's cooperation. The psychological pressure was relentless. Who had already broken? Was silence still loyalty, or was it becoming treason to someone back in London? And while they suffered in quiet, another campaign had already begun, one that would ensure their suffering would be broadcast to the world. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had been waiting for a gift like this. British agents, captured red-handed in a neutral country, attempting to contact so-called German resistance elements. It was perfect. Hitler, barely surviving the beer hall putsch bombing just hours after the Venlo abduction, wasted no time connecting the dots himself, publicly accusing the British Secret Service of attempting to assassinate him, using the Venlo agents as evidence of foreign conspiracy. Photos of Best and Stevens, hands bound, eyes hollow, were circulated through Nazi media. Speeches were drafted, articles penned in Der Angriff, Völkischer Beobachter, and countless local bulletins. The story became a weapon, not just against Britain, but against any internal dissenters. If Hitler's enemies were colluding with foreign powers to kill him, then no German who opposed the regime could be seen as a patriot. The Venlo incident gave the SS the narrative it needed to justify a purge of moderate Wehrmacht officers, intellectuals, and civil servants. The idea of a German resistance had never been more dangerous or more necessary to eliminate. Meanwhile, back in London, chaos was setting in. At first, the Foreign Office believed the incident could be contained. A diplomatic breach, yes, but recoverable. It took weeks before the full extent of the compromise became clear. Codenames had been used in some of the discussions, real MI6 officers referenced by first names or internal shorthand. Office addresses had been loosely described. The Germans now had a skeleton framework of how Britain's foreign intelligence was structured, and they weren't going to keep it to themselves. Abwehr files began to fill up with cross-referenced intel, conversations recorded, maps marked with pins, photographs of operatives once thought secure. MI6's already fragile European network began to fold in on itself. Contacts went dark, couriers disappeared, embassies in Belgium, Holland, and Scandinavia began tightening their internal communications, switching codes weekly, purging old logs. And still, no rescue attempt could be launched for Stevens and Best, not without risking exposure of what remained. Inside Sachsenhausen, the interrogations escalated. A forged letter was handed to Best, supposedly written by a high-ranking British official, instructing him to cooperate with the Germans to save lives. Another forgery was shown to Stevens, claiming Best had already talked. They were played against each other with surgical precision. The question wasn't whether they would break, it was when and how completely. Even their dreams began to warp. Best later described waking up certain he had revealed something critical, only to realize he couldn't distinguish between what he'd said and what he'd imagined under duress. The Nazis weren't interested in torture for its own sake. They were engineers of doubt. With every passing day, MI6 worried not just about what Stevens and Best might say, but how reliable either man still was. Could their confessions be trusted? Had they been turned? Were the Germans now feeding their names and words back into Allied networks as poisoned bait? In the winter of 1939, as Britain reeled from the shock of war and MI6 fought to preserve what fragments it could, another shadow fell across the intelligence community. The Venlo Incident had shown how vulnerable British operations were in neutral territories. It had exposed not just men, but assumptions. That neutrality could protect. That diplomacy could shield espionage. That Britain could afford to dabble in regime change without consequence. Back in Berlin, Schellenberg was awarded a medal. His name began to rise within Himmler's inner circle. His success at Venlo had proved one thing: the British could be baited. Their hunger to believe in a good Germany, in a sane faction waiting to overthrow Hitler, made them predictable. And predictability was fatal in espionage. But even Schellenberg couldn't predict what would happen next. The information he extracted from Venlo wasn't just useful, it was catalytic. The Nazis now had names of station heads, courier routes, even hints at MI6's presence in the Balkans and North Africa. And once the war expanded, that intelligence would be used like a map and a hit list. As for Stevens and Best, their world narrowed to the four walls of their cell and the whispered names of men they might have doomed. They no longer asked about release. They no longer expected rescue. Only one question remained for each of them now. If they had already given the enemy the keys, how long until the enemy opened every door? And outside Sachsenhausen, a new silence spread through Allied circles. Friends and colleagues who had once dined with Stevens in Brussels or met Best in a quiet pub in The Hague began disappearing. Some arrested, some executed, others simply gone without trace. No bullet had been fired, no radio had been intercepted, but the British intelligence web, once fragile and thin, had been shredded from the inside. The Venlo men had been caught in a trap, but the real damage had only just begun. And in a villa outside Berlin, Schellenberg poured himself a drink, stared out at the dark trees, and allowed himself a rare smile. 2 British men taken in silence, dozens of operations compromised, hundreds of lives now at stake. This was the art of modern war. The next move, however, would not come from Berlin. It would come from the shadows of a neutral city, a whispered betrayal, and a British decision that would test every line between war, loyalty, and vengeance. And somewhere, deep behind barbed wire, Richard Stevens blinked at a flickering light above his cot and whispered the name of a man he once thought he could trust. He never saw the guard outside his cell nod and walk away to make a phone call. It was still dark over the rooftops of Whitehall when the cables came in. Cold, clipped, clinical. The Foreign Office barely had time to translate the statements before panic overtook policy. By the time the staffers realized what had happened in Venlo, Berlin was already celebrating. The Reich press offices had rolled out the story with military precision. British intelligence agents caught red-handed on Dutch soil, plotting the assassination of Adolf Hitler. MI6 had just been accused of orchestrating state-sponsored terror, and the only people who might refute that claim were locked behind barbed wire in Sachsenhausen. In London, the reaction was not immediate fury. It was confusion, a stunned paralysis in the face of an accusation so bold, so strategically placed, that it seemed almost surreal. Richard Stevens and Payne Best had gone to meet supposed German conspirators under the illusion that they were laying the groundwork for Hitler's downfall. Instead, their disappearance was now front-page news across Europe, and their mission, once considered a diplomatic masterpiece in the making, had become a national disgrace. The first hours after the abduction saw chaos ripple across the inner corridors of British intelligence. Meetings were called in secure rooms where nobody sat too comfortably. Sir Hugh Sinclair, head of MI6, sat motionless at his desk as the initial reports filtered in. He didn't speak. He only read, over and over, the German declaration that 2 British agents had confessed to plans to destabilize the Third Reich from the inside. No names were officially given, but the insinuations were razor sharp. This had been state-sponsored espionage. The Germans were not accusing rogue elements, they were accusing the Crown. Sinclair's silence wasn't just shock, it was dread, because deep in his mind he already understood what the rest of Whitehall would need days to realize. That the damage wasn't just diplomatic, it was structural. The entire framework of British overseas intelligence had been mapped, probed, and partially exposed. Every conversation Best and Stevens had in Venlo, every careless mention, every hesitant answer to a well-framed German question, was now being picked apart by the SS, brick by brick. Worse still, MI6 had no idea just how much the Germans now knew. As days turned into weeks, the silence from Berlin was replaced by propaganda thunder. Nazi newspapers accused Britain of trying to bomb Hitler in Munich, and framed the Venlo Incident as proof that British diplomacy was a mask for murder. Posters began appearing in German towns, "Trust no envoy, British spies walk in daylight." Radios carried Goering's speeches in which he thundered against the treachery of perfidious Albion. And in between it all, the quiet suffering of Stevens and Best was transformed into spectacle. Their interrogations mined for headlines, their notes forged and distorted into confessions. Inside Whitehall, the implications began to cascade. The Netherlands, once considered a neutral ally, now bristled with diplomatic tension. The Dutch government was humiliated. Not only had a foreign intelligence operation been run on their soil, it had ended with a shootout, a dead police officer, and 2 agents dragged across the border. Officially, the Dutch remained neutral, but behind closed doors, their trust in London had snapped. British promises of careful diplomacy and lawful conduct now rang hollow. Worse, German officials were already hinting that they had proof of Dutch complicity, an implication the Dutch Foreign Ministry could neither confirm nor deny without risking full exposure. At 10 Downing Street, Neville Chamberlain convened emergency meetings behind locked doors. His face, once the embodiment of cautious optimism, now looked aged and pale under the weight of failure. The policy of appeasement, already under fire from the opposition, now stood in the shadow of scandal. What Churchill had warned of in Parliament, that Hitler could not be negotiated with, only stopped, was now being replayed in headlines across the Atlantic. American newspapers, once sympathetic to Chamberlain's pragmatism, now ran with the same brutal headline: "British spies snatched at gunpoint, Hitler blames London." Inside Parliament, the knives came out. Churchill, still sidelined but gaining in voice, leaned into the moment with calculated fury. He declared the Venlo Incident a catastrophe of misjudgment, the direct result of believing one could bargain with a cobra. His speeches carried a new weight now, a resonance that echoed through corridors increasingly filled with doubt. Each word drew blood from Chamberlain's already weakening coalition. Every sentence landed like a warning from the future, that appeasement was not strategy, but surrender. The backbenches grew restless. MI6's failures could no longer be hidden behind the veil of secrecy. Questions were asked in Parliament that no one wanted to answer. Who authorized the meetings? Why were the agents unarmed? Why did no one see the trap coming? The replies were evasive, redacted, and at times entirely fabricated. But the damage was done. Trust had evaporated, not just in the government, but in the very structure of British intelligence. Within MI6, the fallout was even worse. Internal reviews were launched. Field code names, once thought secure, had to be rewritten. Dozens of agents operating in neutral or hostile countries were recalled under emergency orders. Safe houses were abandoned overnight. Contacts in occupied territories went dark, some disappearing altogether. Communications had to be rerouted, radio codes revised, and recruiting paused. In Berlin, the Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst now held partial blueprints of British espionage, enough to compromise years of effort in a single stroke. And yet the most haunting part was not what was known, but what remained unknown. How much had Stevens revealed? How far had Best been pushed? Were there double agents embedded within the networks they discussed? Could the entire operation have been compromised from the beginning? These questions multiplied inside MI6 like shadows in a dark room. Every new revelation cast doubt on the last. Every document retrieved from Berlin, whether planted or authentic, fed the growing paranoia that nothing was safe, no one untouchable. In the cafes of The Hague, neutral diplomats spoke in lowered tones, glancing over shoulders. In Bern and Stockholm, British envoys found themselves quietly shunned. "This is the cost of amateurism," one Swedish intelligence officer told his British counterpart over whiskey and ice. "You walked into a theater and thought it was a chessboard." At Bletchley, code breakers scoured intercepted transmissions for clues, hoping to detect the spread of compromised assets or sudden withdrawals. But the Germans had gone quiet, too quiet, as if they had what they wanted, as if the operation was already over. By February 1940, Chamberlain's grip on power had grown visibly weaker. The fall of Finland to Soviet aggression, the continuing German buildup, and the unraveling of British credibility combined into a storm he could no longer navigate. Letters poured into his office from constituents no longer willing to believe that Hitler could be reasoned with. Churchill, meanwhile, spoke louder and longer. His warnings, once dismissed as alarmism, now felt like prophecy. And while London stumbled, Berlin surged. Hitler's diplomatic position, once brittle, now gleamed with artificial strength. With Venlo, he had proven a point not just to Britain, but to every neutral watching. He could act with impunity, even beyond his borders. He could lie, deceive, abduct, and then control the narrative so thoroughly that even his enemies had to pause and question their own truth. As spring neared, British intelligence tried to regain its footing. Quiet operations resumed under stricter protocols. But something had changed. The old confidence, the belief in discretion, honor among spies, rules of engagement, had died on the road outside Venlo. In its place stood fear, and in some quarters, shame. The notion that British intelligence could walk the line between diplomacy and espionage had been shattered. Now, the lines were drawn in blood, and the enemy no longer wore a uniform. He wore a smile. In a rare moment of private candor, a senior MI6 officer put it bluntly to his American liaison. "We didn't just lose agents in Venlo, we lost the illusion that we were in control." And in that illusion's place, something darker had taken root. A war had begun, one not of tanks or planes, but of deception, sabotage, and betrayal. And in this war, Britain was already limping. The telegram arrived just before dawn, a ciphered transmission from a source buried deep in occupied Europe. It was short, ambiguous, like all the best warnings, but it carried weight. "They have names, more than you think." And just like that, another page turned, not with a bang, but with a whisper. In one night, British intelligence lost not just 2 men, but their standing, their secrecy, and perhaps their soul. They were ghosts now, walking, breathing, but no longer trusted by the world they once served. Richard Stevens and Sigismund Payne Best had returned to England after years in German captivity, but they came home to silence. There were no parades, no medals, no welcome committee, only closed doors, lowered eyes, and the cold hum of bureaucratic disapproval. What they carried back with them wasn't just trauma. It was the lingering stench of failure, of secrets lost, of reputations shattered, of a country that had stumbled into a trap of its own design. Venlo had exposed too much. Not just to the Germans, who now had names, structures, and a frighteningly clear picture of how British intelligence operated, but to Britain itself. The entire security establishment had been caught flat-footed, lulled into naivety by its own outdated faith in decency and diplomacy. The veneer of gentlemanly espionage, cultivated since the days of Kipling and Queen Victoria, had been torn away. In its place was something darker, more unforgiving, and absolutely necessary. For Winston Churchill, who returned to power with a vengeance in May 1940 as Prime Minister, the lesson was stark. Britain was at war with a predator that respected neither treaties nor tradition. The Nazi regime had no use for codes of conduct, for neutral zones, for handshake deals made in border cafes. They had weaponized lies, sharpened treachery into an art, and perfected the theater of false resistance. And if Britain hoped to survive, it needed to fight on that same terrain: shadows, smoke, deception, the world of illusions. Churchill was not one for subtlety. He moved quickly and without apology. The first step was simple. The system that had allowed Venlo to happen had to die. The Secret Intelligence Service, known publicly as MI6, had grown complacent and clubby. It was still operating as if the game hadn't changed, as if the world were still governed by unwritten rules of honor among spies. That era was over. From its ashes, something new would rise, something leaner, meaner, relentless. It was called the Special Operations Executive, SOE. Its mandate was unambiguous. Churchill put it plainly: set Europe ablaze. There would be no illusions of neutrality, no hand-wringing over international law, no tolerance for naivety. The SOE wasn't built to observe. It was built to disrupt. Its agents would sabotage railways, assassinate collaborators, arm resistance cells, and do whatever it took to make Nazi-occupied Europe ungovernable. Its birth was painful. The old guard resisted. There were turf wars behind closed doors, memos soaked in passive aggression, old-school intelligence men who scoffed at the idea of irregular warfare as un-British. But Churchill overruled them. He had seen the abyss and understood that victory would not come through clean hands. The war in the shadows was every bit as important as the one on the beaches or in the skies. Behind the scenes, MI6 licked its wounds. The Venlo incident had left scars that would never quite heal. Files had been burned, careers destroyed. The Germans, through their cunning sting operation, had drawn a spiderweb of connections that reached from the cafes of the Low Countries to the corridors of Whitehall. Best and Stevens had given up just enough: names, phrases, organizational patterns to make the damage lasting. Even after the war, those same names would pop up again in Soviet espionage investigations, Cold War reckonings, and counterintelligence sweeps. For Payne Best, captivity had altered his soul. The man who once projected polished confidence now spoke with hesitation, his sentences occasionally interrupted by long silences, as if mentally replaying a scene he could never escape. Stevens, who had been the more skeptical of the two during the Venlo operation, bore his own burden. The gnawing thought that he had seen the trap coming, but lacked the courage or the authority to stop it. They had become symbols of a British intelligence failure so complete that it took years to admit its scope. The interrogations in Germany had not been crude affairs. The SS wasn't interested in beatings or broken teeth. They had used time instead. Isolation. Friendly conversations that slowly drifted toward key questions. Gestapo officers pretending to be sympathetic defectors. Forged letters from London claiming that MI6 had disavowed them. Menacing whispers that other agents had talked and they'd better do the same. And always, the quiet threat: there would be no escape unless they cooperated. Over the months and years, even the strongest will begins to flicker. Best and Stevens gave away more than they intended, enough to rewrite the war's opening chapter. When they finally returned to England in 1945, thin, haunted, and half forgotten, they found themselves politically inconvenient. Their experience was a living reminder of what had gone wrong in 1939. Neither man was given a public platform. Neither was decorated for bravery. They weren't pariahs, exactly, but they were reminders of failure in a country that desperately wanted stories of redemption. The files about their capture remained partially classified for decades. The silence around their names was louder than any condemnation. But in that silence, something monstrous and effective took root. The Special Operations Executive grew quickly, drawing from poets, saboteurs, linguists, mountaineers, and anarchists. They were trained in demolition, forgery, assassination, and blackmail. They learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to kill without a sound, how to plant a bomb on a train and vanish before the fireball. It was a far cry from the tweed-clad officers of MI6 sipping tea and quoting Cicero. These were wartime operatives born from Venlo's humiliation. SOE agents infiltrated France, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece. They armed the Maquis, the partisans, the resistance fighters who would later be credited with sabotaging entire divisions of Nazi troops. In Paris, a single SOE agent with a lipstick pistol and cyanide pill could change the course of a city's fate. In Yugoslavia, they navigated minefields and betrayal with only a compass and sheer nerve. In Poland, they coordinated airdrops of explosives and radios to partisans operating under the nose of the Gestapo. Venlo had taught the British one critical lesson. If you waited for clean intelligence, you waited too long. You struck first. You asked forgiveness never. By the time the war turned in the Allies' favor, the SOE had become a legend wrapped in myth. Some of their missions would never be acknowledged. Others would be distorted by memory and propaganda. But the intent behind them was clear. Britain had been fooled once, humiliated, stripped of secrecy, left stumbling into war with its trousers around its ankles. That would not happen again. Churchill, for all his faults and flair, understood this. He didn't just create a new department. He reshaped the entire moral center of British intelligence. The war had clarified one thing. If Britain wanted to survive, it had to become something harder, colder, and less sentimental than it had ever been. There was no room anymore for illusions of a noble enemy. The Nazis had poisoned that well forever. And Venlo had been the first taste. After the war, both MI6 and the SOE would evolve. The SOE was eventually disbanded in 1946, its functions absorbed into other agencies. But its spirit lingered. Its alumni became instructors, consultants, even directors. The idea of black operations, sabotage networks, and deep cover resistance cells had taken root and would bloom again in the Cold War. And every one of those dark blossoms could trace its roots back to a cold November morning on a Dutch road when two British intelligence officers climbed into a car believing they were saving the world, and instead delivered it into a nightmare. Best and Stevens never quite recovered. Their later years were quiet, contemplative. They gave carefully worded interviews, wrote guarded memoirs, and kept most of the horror to themselves. They had been used, not just by the Germans, but by history itself. And yet, in their failure, lay the seed of a new doctrine, one that would define Western intelligence for decades to come. The lesson of Venlo echoed in the halls of every intelligence academy, from Langley to Vauxhall Cross. Never trust without verification. Never assume your enemy's weakness. And never, under any circumstance, believe that a friendly face can't hide a blade. The world after Venlo was not safer, but it was wiser, bloodier, sharper. And as the SOE began lighting fires across Europe, it wasn't just about winning battles. It was about erasing the stain of Venlo, one explosion, one dead collaborator, one derailed train at a time. The war in the shadows had begun, and Britain, newly reborn in fire, was finally ready to play by the new rules. Because in the end, Venlo had killed something. Not two men, not just a reputation, but an era. And from its ashes, the modern spy was born, cold-eyed, steel-hearted, and wide awake. They thought it was over. They thought the wreckage had been cleared, the scandal swallowed, and the price of failure silently paid in exile, disgrace, or death. But the war had only just begun. Above ground with tanks and treaties, yes, but also far below, in cold rooms filled with cigarette smoke, carbon copies, and quiet names underlined in red. What Payne Best and Richard Stevens never saw, what most of Whitehall never saw, was that their kidnapping wasn't the end of the operation. It was the beginning. Because while London reeled, Berlin read. And within weeks of their arrival in the Reich, the real machinery of the trap began to turn. Not toward propaganda, not toward humiliation, but toward something even colder: intelligence analysis. Behind the walls of Sachsenhausen, the interrogations had never really stopped. They just shifted forms: less beatings, more tea, more trick questions, more silences allowed to stretch until nerves frayed and memories tangled. Schellenberg, ever the patient spider, documented everything. Not just what Best and Stevens said, but what they didn't say. Every hesitation was a possible lead. Every name mispronounced, a code to be broken. Every slight inconsistency in narrative was combed for hidden meaning. And when reports were delivered to Reinhard Heydrich, they weren't simple summaries. They were blueprints. The SS hadn't just been fishing for propaganda. They had netted something far more valuable: a partial but authentic glimpse into Britain's real war strategy. Not troop movements or battle plans, but something even more sensitive: its networks. The slow unraveling of MI6's internal code words, its safe houses, its contacts in Europe, and most dangerously, its lists of supposed German contacts. Some of the names Best and Stevens confirmed under duress. Some they dropped by accident. Some they whispered in an attempt to seem cooperative and buy better treatment. Some they gave up simply because they believed the Germans already knew them. But whatever their reasons, the SS didn't care. They compiled. They cross-referenced. They began to draw lines. And what began as a deception operation designed to frame Britain for a fake assassination attempt on Hitler evolved into something much darker. Because as the war unfolded and the German resistance inside the Wehrmacht, the Abwehr, and even the civil service began to stir, the SS found themselves holding a strange advantage. They had already been told, months before, some of the names that would later surface in plots against Hitler. And whether those names came from fact, fiction, or the exhausted mouths of British officers in captivity didn't matter. They were now leads, and the SS followed them. By 1941, as Operation Barbarossa hurled the Reich eastward, and the noose around Hitler's enemies inside Germany quietly began to tighten, some of the individuals identified in Schellenberg's Venlo files began to disappear. Not in dramatic show trials, not yet, but in quiet reassignments, silent arrests, transfers to the Eastern Front that often ended in death. The SS wasn't acting on perfect intelligence, but they didn't need perfect. They needed just enough. Enough to erode the fragile scaffolding of resistance within their own regime. Enough to poison relationships, enough to spread fear. And in this strange, tragic irony, British errors at Venlo, born of desperation, misjudgment, and a craving for influence, may have helped bury some of the very Germans who were willing to risk everything to stop Hitler from within. Did London know? That question would haunt the survivors of Venlo long after the guns fell silent. In quiet corners of the Foreign Office, there were whispers, memos never officially acknowledged, references to follow-up effects or collateral network damage across occupied Europe. But no investigation was ever ordered. No official reckoning was made. The line between real damage and speculative hindsight blurred until it became convenient to forget. But for men like Schellenberg, it had always been clear. The British had opened a door, and the SS had walked through it. The files themselves, kept under lock in the RSHA's archive, were chilling not because of their brutality, but because of their precision. There were tables, graphs, timelines. Statements from Best and Stevens were cross-tabulated with earlier intelligence from informants in Switzerland, Belgium, and even South America. In the SS mind, Venlo hadn't been a fluke. It had been a masterstroke. A single act of deception that not only destroyed British credibility in Europe, but gave the Reich a strategic edge in its hunt for traitors at home. And what made it all worse was this: some of those Germans were real. There really had been brave men and women inside the Nazi state, quietly passing word to the West, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that Britain would one day support a coup, that their messages, smuggled out through embassies, family connections, or couriers on neutral trains, might reach someone like Stevens or Best. And in the chaos of Venlo, in the naive trust extended to Schellenberg's fake resistance, in the careless recording of names, some of those patriots were marked, and many were never heard from again. That part of the story was never told at Nuremberg. It didn't make headlines in the Times or the Guardian. There were no post-war investigations, no footnotes in intelligence memoirs. Only fragments remained, half-burned memos from Berlin, intercepted German transmissions decrypted too late, and the memories of a few surviving agents who knew, even then, that something had gone horribly wrong. That a trap set for 2 British officers had become a net for hundreds. That Venlo had not just exposed secrets, it had spilled blood. And yet, even this wasn't the end of it. Because long after the war, as Germany was divided and Schellenberg traded secrets with Western intelligence in exchange for protection, the files resurfaced. Not all of them. Many had been destroyed in 1945 or hidden by Himmler's loyalists or buried deep in Soviet archives. But enough. Enough to piece together the outlines of what had really happened. Enough to realize that the Venlo incident hadn't just been a blunder. It had been a turning point. A moment when espionage stopped being a game of gentlemen and became a weapon of war, with casualties not just on the battlefield, but in alleyways, safe houses, and anonymous prison cells. Years later, when historians attempted to reconstruct the internal purges of the German officer corps before the July 20th plot, they found strange references to suspects who had once been flagged by the SS as foreign-influenced or pre-compromised. Many of those notes traced back to early documents, Schellenberg's early documents. And while correlation does not prove causation, the pattern was hard to ignore. Something in those files had informed later crackdowns. Something had kept the Gestapo one step ahead of the resistance. And that something had its roots in Venlo. It's easy now to judge, to say MI6 should have been more skeptical, that the Dutch should have refused to look the other way, that Best and Stevens should never have agreed to meet in the open without protection. But none of them knew what was coming. None of them imagined that a sting operation in a quiet border town could echo into the deepest corners of the Reich and shape the fate of its last true opponents. None of them thought they'd become weapons, not just in the hands of their captors, but in the silent warfare of files, rumors, and suspicions. The SS did. The SS always knew that intelligence was not about truth. It was about control. And Venlo had given them control. In the end, the Venlo incident was not simply a failure of security, or courage, or diplomacy. It was a mirror, held up not just to British arrogance, but to the entire idea of civilized intelligence work. And the reflection it offered was not heroic, or romantic, or noble. It was bloodstained. It was compromised. And for those willing to look into it, the hardest part was realizing the truth wasn't on the surface. It was buried in names, in files, in footsteps never taken. The trap didn't end when the car door slammed shut in Venlo. It ended years later in Berlin cellars and Russian forests and silent executions that no one ever linked to that rainy November day. Because sometimes the greatest damage a lie can do isn't in the moment it's told, but in the truth it leaves buried. And Venlo left a lot buried. The question now is simple: what else is still down there? They thought the war would wash Venlo clean, that once the tanks rolled west and Hitler lay defeated in a bunker, the affair would slip into footnotes. But the silence following the Reich's collapse only deepened the shadows over Venlo. Because history doesn't simply end where headlines fade, it continues in training manuals, quiet academy lectures, and whispered warnings in embassies. And sometimes, most dangerously, in the belief that intelligence can still be practiced as if Venlo never happened. In the spring of 1946, in the newly rebuilt MI6 headquarters, a bullet-scarred veteran officer stood before a room of young recruits. He spoke not of heroism, but of mistakes. He told them, "Trust no message you haven't verified. Assume the resistance could be a lie. Your saddest failures will come from what you believe rather than what you know." At that moment, the ghost of Payne Best and Richard Stevens wasn't in their names. It was in the blueprint of every new counterintelligence training exercise. Venlo became case study #1 in training academies across Britain, America, and even ally states like Canada and Australia. Faceless agents read the transcripts, not just of what Stevens and Best had said, but how they said it: hesitations, half-answers, questions phrased to look innocuous. Recruits were taught to spot anomalies not in explosive code books, but in polite conversation. The hard lesson was clear: deception doesn't always make noise. It dramatizes restraint. Across the Atlantic, OSS instructors in Washington dissected the British failures like surgeons examining an unguarded artery. OSS doctrine began to shift. Cold War spycraft built on Venlo's lessons. The idea of moderate resistance factions within enemy regimes was not discarded, but suspect. CIA briefings cautioned operatives overseas: do not buy too eagerly into internal anti-regime narratives. False flag stories were no longer urban legend. They were proven strategy. In post-war Europe, as decolonization stirred new intrigues and Cold War propaganda warred beneath the Iron Curtain, Venlo's legacy echoed again. Yugoslav partisans were suddenly their own alien conspirators. Middle Eastern factions were alternately courted and distrusted, depending on whether their supposed moderate wings moved too quickly. Politicians whispered that British and Allied intelligence still sometimes laid traps for imagination, not for reality. The moral trap of Venlo remained relevant. Hope can be weaponized as effectively as malice. In intelligence circles, the idea popped up again and again. Did Britain choose to ignore warning signs at Venlo because it needed the myth of diplomacy more than the facts of caution? The question was uncomfortable, but rarely answered. Years later, some retired officers privately speculated that London's failure to investigate the psychological aftermath of the incident had been deliberate, an attempt to close the book, bury the ghosts, and rebuild confidence quickly. Payne Best and Richard Stevens lived into the 1970s, both quietly haunted by what they had become. Idealists in the service of a nation they trusted, they had been both instruments and victims of a game far colder than either ideology or diplomacy. In old age, Best described Venlo as a lesson in gravity, how high belief can lift you and how far it can drop you once the rope is cut. Stevens, quieter, sometimes described his time in Sachsenhausen as learning that truth can freeze your blood. Neither man asked for absolution. Neither expected forgiveness. They accepted that their names, once involved in illusions, became part of a future intelligence culture built around suspicion. Across modern intelligence agencies, Venlo remains a cautionary tale. The British MI6 still teaches new recruits its core lesson. Intelligence is not about faith or goodwill. It is about verification. The CIA, FSB, Mossad, DGSE, each institution, in its own way, references the incident when warning agents about false flag diplomacy. It is less popular now, more whispered than published, but the ghost of Venlo lingers in briefings, reminders. Never meet an unknown officer in neutral territory without independent confirmation. The moral tensions remain unresolved. The hope that Stevens and Best held, of good Germans, of quiet patriots, turned out to be either illusion or poison. Had there truly been real conspirators inside the Wehrmacht, they were either killed, purged or shadowed by the same files fed to SS intelligence. And that raises a chilling question. Did Venlo collapse resistance from within Germany not just through direct betrayal, but by poisoning the very idea of German self-liberation? Diplomats and intelligence officers today still face that trap. In conflicts around the world, moderate opposition groups court Western contact, offspring of whispered promises and fragile documents. And always, the first question asked quietly, is this a Venlo ghost? Because the line between negotiation and deception is often so fine that missing it can change the course of history. Stevens's written memoirs end with a sentence that is not poignantly reflective, but quietly bitter. We were too polite to suspect pretenders, and our courtesy cost us everything. Best, in private correspondence, wrote, "We wanted Germans to help us avoid war. Instead, they helped engineer one." Science fiction, Cold War thrillers, modern streaming dramas, all have drawn from this real incident's DNA. The idea that an apparently honorable contact might be SS in disguise, that intelligence agencies can manufacture resistance to test foreign responses, that sometimes the greatest deception is offering exactly what the other side wants to believe. Venlo is more than an episode. It is a warning, a mirror, a dark invocation to every viewer, operative, or enthusiast who still believes there is nobility in espionage, that any whisper of moderate factions inside an enemy regime comes with price. That caution, suspicion, verification, they are not betrayals of diplomacy, but its only bulwark. Venlo taught spy agencies how to lie better and how to listen less. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of today's intelligence empires, the ghost of Venlo still waits for the next optimist.